back to our cell phones. We need to take it further.
Yeah. So I think on the topic of movements, I'd like to bring in Culls here, the Centre of Applied Legal Studies, to really just discuss the people behind the movements and what you believe is one of the biggest challenges they are facing right now.
You know, Sasha, it's almost like a double-edged sword here.
Yeah.
Because, you know, if you're a survivor and you're speaking out, there's a lot of victimization that comes, you know, to you, etc. I mean, everything from the police to your immediate family to your community, all of that. But in addition to that, if you are someone that is, you know, actively leading certain movements, for example, the hashtag #MeToo movement, or whatever, you're actively involved in advocating against gender-based violence or gendered rights, etc., all of those things, there is, we found, victimization that you experience because you are doing that.
Yes.
And I say it's a double-edged sword because it's as if there's a move to silence people from speaking against you know, gender-based violence and other issues. Activists that fight for gender rights and sexual minority rights face everything from cyberbullying was one of the biggest things that you know, activists mentioned doing. And like I said, we did research with this, so literally speaking to different gender activists and trying to understand what experiences they're having. Cyberbullying is a big thing. Why? Also because, you know, like my panelists alluded to as well, social media is a big platform for activism. And so, unfortunately, then it's also one of the biggest platforms in which they receive this sort of victimization, this pushback. The other thing is a lot of discrediting. It's interesting that what we also found is queer activists, women activists, are more at risk of being discredited than men. And that's interesting because there's always this concerted effort to discredit, especially women that are leading movements, queer activists that are leading movements. There's this concerted effort to discredit them. And so not only are you trying to shine attention to this issue of gender-based violence, but because you are doing that, you are also experiencing some form of victimization. And that makes it difficult because it then sort of says, don't say anything about this, don't challenge power, don't try to shut down what's happening, don't try to speak out against what's happening, don't try to call for accountability for what it is. Which of course nobody can live in that situation. You know, toxic masculinity is toxic for everyone, for men, for women, for everyone, you know?
Yes.
So we can't live in a society where these things continue unchallenged, where you're not allowed to say anything. But for those who dare to say something, they face so much victimization. And it's also sort of a means of making people scared, you know, of making people scared to speak out, intimidating people. A lot of activists also mentioned about how, you know, they would be sort of intimidated. Sometimes there's even a use of the civil or criminal system, you know, to victimize them. So I'm being unlawfully arrested, you know, being faced with defamation suits. That's also a big thing. Sometimes being faced with protection orders as well that are instituted against you if you dare to call out your perpetrator or something like that. And so there's this continuously continuous means of trying to make people not say anything about it. And again, this goes back to sort of challenging how we change the society that's so high of gender-based violence. How do we change that if people that are taking the effort to change that are facing this form of victimization? And it's rapid. There's a rapid shrinking civic space. It's continuing to grow. And I think we're not paying enough attention to this that's happening, but it's so integral to us really getting the kind of change society that we're looking to have.
Yeah. So, I mean, understanding that there is a great deal of intersectionality that is at play, with use of the gendered lens, with the gendered approach, let's unpack what the woman activist would experience. What would that look like for them?
You know, we spoke to one of the, in doing our report, spoke to one activist who said she was arrested several times because she's an active activist in her community. But she was arrested again few days after she had given birth. And, you know, you can imagine kind of the implications of that. She lives alone with her kids. She's just given birth to a baby. She's picked up again by police, and this time for something that she wasn't even involved in, for a protest that happened that she wasn't even involved in because she was in hospital giving birth. And so you see how victimization as a whole is not good for any activist, you know, whatever gender you are. But you see with women activists particularly, you find all of these nuances, you know. And it's also, what we found as well is that it's as if women human rights defenders or women activists are seen as sort of easier targets for killings as well. I'm sure a lot of you are aware about Mfigile Njangase, who was killed for being she was a woman human rights defender in her community, in a mining affected community, and she was killed for her work really related to activism. And so there's this feeling that you know, it's easier to kill women human rights defenders, and so they have to sort of take more concerted efforts to protect themselves. And then, of course, you know, when a woman is arrested and is sitting in jail, what are those impacts that's having with her? You know, queer activists have also mentioned how, you know, even within their own spaces, even within their own activist spaces, there's still this sort of ignorance, you know, even from fellow activists, etc. A lot of intimidation as well, a lot of harassment as well. So there really is all of these gendered impacts that come alive when you look at victimization, and really taking us into having to have these discussions on how do we address these things and how do we solve problems.
Yes. Now, although we can obviously agree that women have been disproportionately affected by gender-based violence, I think we can also recognize that GBV transcends gender, and that there are other groups who are plagued with this but don't receive the necessary attention. And I think, you know, Tammy, that's where you come in and, you know, discuss the impact and how GBV impacts the LGBTQI plus community.
Don't worry.
I was
LGBTQI
A plus.
Yeah, you know. I was going to say earlier on when Umuholo was speaking that I think we speak about women a lot, and I appreciate that, but also just generally there are lots of other boy children who go through all of this. There are it's everyone who goes through some kind of gender-based violence. I mean, you think of kids living in homes where they're being abused, you know, by parents. So we must factor in the issue of hate crimes being under the GBV banner, you know.
Yes.
I mean, I've gone through some parts of the NSP, and often you find that there's so many. Point 6.1 has also got an inclusion of LGBTQI people, but there's no real lived experience of how that translates, you know. What are those plans put in place to ensure that, you know, as a youth, I'm no longer young, by the way. As a youth, I dated a guy who was physically abusive, and it took me a while. I mean, I never reported it. I confronted him later, but you know, would beat me up, throw me down the stairs, and I'd stand up and say, "I'm sorry because, goddamn, I want this guy to stop doing this thing." But you realize that it's a lot of trauma that comes with, you know, your upbringing. A lot of us in queer spaces, you were talking earlier that there is someone knows a girl who's been raped or whatever. It's the same for other queer people everywhere else. And in fact, I think it might be a controversial statement to make, but a lot of us have interacted with rape at some level, you know.
Yes.
And so for me, it's the stigma that's attached to reporting.
Yes.
It's also the toxic masculinity thing we're talking about. So IPV is a thing that lives within us as queer community. It's like two guys, when you go and report a case, they're like, so who's who and who beat who and why? And there's always that thing that they suggest you do, can you guys go and talk about it first? Again, and also like, you know, I sit with a lot of lesbian women who, you know, some, you know, present themselves or to the world as butch, you know, and I think the stories I've heard has been about how toxic masculinity has played its part in abusing their partner, you know, whether it was financial, physical, sexually, and it's really historic, you know. I think you if you've grown up or you were raised in a home where you watched a lot of abuse happen in front of you, it becomes a little bit difficult for you at a later stage to actually stand up and to speak or to say this was wrong, this was right. There are also issues of patriarchy princesses that exist. So many of our sisters stand up for their brothers who continue to abuse other women, and our mothers do the same because they come from that history. And the same happens with queer groups, you know. We don't talk about it. We're so used to that abuse, so used to the abuse, and we know that with so many cases that have been taken forward, nothing or not a lot has happened in terms of the criminal justice system, and so that discourages a queer body from going to report. But we're also scarred internally, and I think it's only fair that we acknowledge it, we own it, and we talk about it. We can be abusive to each other as partners and even as friends, as colleagues, as siblings. It's layered. The various layers of that domestic violence that exists, you know. So those things had to be unpacked a lot more, so that we're able to not feel like I'm gay and I can't go and report a case. I'm lesbian and this is what they're going to do. Do you know what I mean? Trans women on a daily basis go through the most, and they go through the most when it gets to, you know, the SAPs, because it's like, but I'm trans, I've been abused, you're trying to figure out if I'm a man or a woman, and which cell am I being taken to, and you know, like there's so much, and I feel like there's not enough education that's given to us as citizens to empower us on what they're supposed to do when you get to the police station, what's supposed to happen. I had a case like 3 weeks ago where one lady took a case to the police station, and they said, no, we can't actually open the case for you because it needs to be something that's resolved between the two of you. And I'm like, no, that's not a decision you take.
Exactly.
You know, when you're at a police station, you open your job, your primary job is to open the case. Whether or not I want to follow through with the case, it's got nothing to do with you. I know that the system is supposed to follow through either way, whether I appear one day or not, but your job is to register the case and register it as I'm saying as a victim, this is where I am. So there's a lot that needs to be really understood from that level. I feel like we don't know our rights, and you know, this is why a Human Rights Festival is here. We don't know our rights, and I think the people who serve us equally don't know their rights. And they don't know the law.
Wow. So I think on the topic of secondary victimization, because that's what it is. Secondary victimization that is experienced by the justice system, by this community, and the policy that governs this, you know, because there is a disconnect in terms of what's implemented on the level of the executive and what's experienced on the ground, because you mentioned the NSP earlier. What are your views around the National Strategic Plan's core messaging around GBV for the LGBTQIA plus community?
I think it's a beautiful document. It reads really well. But
does it translate though?
No. And not to take it away from them, I think they've done well, but there has to be like additional effort being put behind ensuring that we are dealing with issues of domestic violence or GBV under that banner at the level of the LGBTQIA plus community. We're always like there at the end, you know, there's no urgency around ensuring that there's clear messaging that is there. So you give people 1.6 billion and you say, here it's going to the GBV project in the country, and we don't know where or nobody is being accountable for saying
For
there's
where it
400
went.
million that's sitting at social development to give psychosocial services to other people. There's 600 that's sitting, or 200 that's sitting at health, and there's 400 million that's sitting at SAPS. So I think all of those things must also be made clear to people so that we understand what access do we actually have, and what does this pretty white paper mean for my life, you know.
Yes.
I mean, you know, it's like reading a speech, right? Because I think that we read speeches really well, and they're written really well, and they're written to say the right thing and to always have the right answer for everyone, and it's not true. I think we must also not be allergic to people's reality. And their truths, and we as citizens and South Africans must also be brave enough to say when we're wrong and when we have not done right by our people, and find out what is the best way to solve this problem. So to answer your question, is like, when you do write those documents, yes, there's a small group of people consulted, but what does it look like in terms of executing it? So when we talk inclusion, include us from there, so that we
Yes.
don't feel like, oh, there's this group out, including the LGBTI community, and we don't know where to go. So bring everybody in, invite everybody in to play their part, essentially, you know?
Yeah.
There's a disconnect. There's a huge disconnect. I mean, I imagine if women who are activists on a daily basis around GBV are complaining about understanding the NSP and are complaining about some of the processes, what more of me, who is a queer woman, man, who's got all of these challenges? Where's my go-to place?
Exactly. So important that we get to a space where we live by, you know, what we say and actually just put things into action. I've always craved this, you know, moving from this space into the arena, because that's where we're meant to be playing. And I think
on the ground.
Yeah, on the ground. And I think just bringing it back to Carl's here, still on the topic of the LGBTQIA plus community. From your point of view, what are the activists experiencing? And I think you and Tammy can actually also have that conversation, because you yourself...
Do you know, strangely, just before we started the conversation, an audience member asked me a question and said, what are the stats of like LGBTQI people and GBV or IPV or whatever, the violence? What are the stats? And I was like, well, you know, we can't really be accurate because there aren't really a lot of stats. So a lot of times we depend on like development aid to come in and help us do research work. In this country, nothing is a problem unless you can present a research document that says, here's a problem. But here we are. I'm a living example and I'm living proof, and I'm here and I'm telling you there's a problem, but there isn't enough done for this country and for queer people living in this country to ensure that there's proper research put behind understanding the intricate experiences of our queer community. So research is always important, but research also goes to those other individuals, and then maybe we'll bring in like the LGBTQI community. And then maybe when somebody else actually does give you those stats, we'll just make them part of the document. So I think let it be open and broad, you know. We can't every single day, and I'm getting into your next question, like around activism, like on a daily basis, we're always looking at ourselves thinking, should we be doing this again? Am I going to be bashing somebody else's door? Am I screaming at a police station? Am I screaming inside a boardroom? Am I shouting at the door of this? Am I, you know, like it feels like we're just always protesting, you know. Don always says we must come here at Conhill and bring all your demands to the constitutional court here. It's the highest court of the land, but it always must be a fight before we get to, hey, somebody is listening to you. You know, it always must be those cases that are highlighted. So
why isn't it autonomous?
During COVID, we had so many killings of the queer community. We can only count, like, say, 30 or so plus people that we think we know, names that we know, but there are queer people that are killed on a daily basis, and that's as a result of a hate crime. So how are we making sure that that is being carried by what we're doing as the GBV program? You know, how are we addressing all those things? Because if it's not a Tami, a Gala, or Exodus chapter 2, Utingo, or Pifsek, somebody else is not, we're not doing, enough. And the only time media also plays a role. Like the only time you ever want to cover things around queer people is like when we're going to Pride and we're all colorful. There's so many different stories on a daily basis that affect us that we're not covering. So everybody's got a role to play. And I feel like when you ask about the challenges of like activists on a daily basis, it's how to identify everyone's role and to know exactly what it is that they're supposed to do.
Exactly. And Kels, do you guys have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think inclusiveness is so important. And the problem is also that there's a big misunderstanding of, and I say misunderstanding because I don't want to say it's just an attitude problem, but let's call it a misunderstanding.
I think it's the latter even.
But you can also say
you
that.
You can say it's the latter. It's okay.
Of for example, police, what they're supposed to be doing in protests. Let me use that as an example. The Right to Protest project does a lot of work around the right to protest in South Africa, and they've done lots of research reports on this as well. Because police don't understand what's their job at protests, there's this continuous excessive use of force on protesters. There's this mishandling of protesters, unlawful arrests. And we call them unlawful arrests because just because somebody's protesting doesn't mean they have to be arrested. That's not a thing, right? And so there's a lot of these unlawful arrests, a lot of this excessive use of force. And now the issue is that it's now also private security. Private security is also now guilty of these use of excessive force, mishandling of protesters. Was it last year where someone was killed, a bystander during a Wits protest, who was shot and died? Do you understand? Somebody that wasn't even part of they were passing by, they weren't even part of the protest. And so you see this continuing in space. So that's why I say I think it's a bit of an attitude or a misunderstanding of what people's rights are, and that people have a right to protest. And what is your job, or what is your role when you are security, when you are police in a protest, is to just make sure that everybody can be safe. And by everybody, you mean protesters as well. That when protesters are exercising their right to protest, their constitutional protected right to protest, when they're expressing their right to freedom of expression, that they are also safe, that they're able to do that in a safe environment. And so I think we need to make sure that state, police, private security, and that's a very controversial one, but we won't get into that. Private security, for argument's sake, also knows what is their role, or what are they supposed to be doing in that places, so that we don't find ourselves in instances where police say stuff like, there was a protest, was it last week or so, the right to protest was again assisting that movement, and police said something ridiculous like, you guys are, it was a feministic movement that was protesting, I'll arrest you now, you feministic movements, but saying it in a derogatory manner. And so having that kind of attitude, that kind of idea of this is how you need to treat people. And I want to say this as well because it really also reflects how there's a treatment of black people in a particular way. There's a treatment of poor working class people in a particular way by police. And you see this unfolding. And we understand that, in order for these things to stop, there has to be some way in which when police do this, they are held to account. There shouldn't be this power dynamics, these power relations where even, the Metro Police feel like, no, you need to pay us a fee in order for us to grant you permission to protest. You don't grant anyone permission to protest. You notify the authorities that you're going to have a protest, then they must put things into place. So that's why I'm saying there's this a misunderstanding of what people's rights, and when people that are in authority misunderstand the rights of other people or don't want to understand the rights of other people, there's the suppression of people's rights. And the suppression of people's rights can lead to a place where there's this explosion of victimization and etc. And so just taking it back again to the LGBTQI community as well, when there's a misunderstanding of how are people supposed to be treated, people as a whole, you know, there shouldn't be this thing of, oh, it's a secondary thought, oh, let's by the way, the LGBTQI community, no, that shouldn't be the place. It should be from the get-go, we are including all people, and everybody's rights matter, and everybody, you know, the issues, the rights, the advocacy of all people should be front and center. There shouldn't be this thing of there are certain people within the community that must feel like they are, you know, on the outside or anything like that. So there really must be concerted efforts to make sure that everybody's rights are respected, but most importantly, when people are doing whatever that they need to do in order to advocate for their rights, in order to you know, educate, accept whatever that it is that people want to do, there is space to be able to do that, because that's what a democratic South Africa should be. And immediately, if we shrink this space to be able to allow people to freely be themselves, freely express themselves, freely associate, then we immediately then need to challenge what we call then a democratic, inclusive society. Yeah.
I think the issue of language also, just to jump in there, Sasha, the issue of language, so we worked on a project in the Eastern Cape, and we were sitting with a bunch of queer children who were talking about how some of them have laid charges and they've lost their cases because I think the law also becomes very technical at some point. And when you come from rural areas, you know, we don't have like honest conversations, or we're not like straightforward, this is a penis and this is a vagina, right? Because it's not a thing. It's not the conversation. And so when you don't teach your children from an early age what things are and call them by their name and say that this is wrong and this is right, you're going to end up in a situation where when you go to court, you read this document and somebody says, umalume uthathe ubhuti wakhe wamfaka kusisi wami. It's like, umalume uthathe ubhuti wakhe wamfaka kusisi wami. That's not like the language that we're speaking. These kids are struggling. They just want to say, he took his penis and, you know, he raped me. So people get away because of like technicalities, and people get away. I mean, the system is, I know of like unfortunate cases where it was because the translator could not translate what this person was saying, and the interpreter could not take that and take it forward, and this is how they lost the case. And they know, and it's law, and judges have to sit there and say, okay, this is the case, and it's going like this. You know, so language becomes important, but also let's teach our children from a very early age now to say things as they are. Let's like validate and affirm their feelings, because it's so easy for us to just miss the fact that you were just told by your child that this is what happened, and it's a concern, you know. It's like, oh, we grew up and our uncles used to say this, and they used to say, oh, you're growing a big bum, and it's like, absolutely not. Don't comment on my bum, and you're my uncle, and don't talk to me like that, don't look at me like that, so all of these things, like, you have to be able to empower children from a very early age, and you need to ensure that they know what their right is. And they know how to report that even to family members, because I feel like also even within family, we don't take these conversations forward because, oh my God, oh, that's such a shame for the family. We must report that my dad raped me.
Because what happens in the house stays in the house.
So there's a lot that we need to really look into. So many unfortunate cases are as a result of us not being honest with each other and not holding people accountable.
Yeah.
I wanna, sorry, just to add to that, what you were saying, what stays in the house, what happens in the house stays in the house. It's a continuous fight for this, to break down that dichotomy. Like there's private and there's public, right? And those things can't be, they don't intersect. They are different, they are the separate side. So whatever the state, whatever's public mustn't be or mustn't find itself in issues that are private. And really having to break that down, because it is, and you know, a lot of the protests that have happened raising awareness around gender-based violence have also challenged, you know, the state's attitude of saying that, they need to, on high level, deal with courts or whatever, but not really implement things that impact, even so-called private spaces to try to challenge gender-based violence, to try to change, ideas around gender-based violence, what it is, what it isn't, and really put a responsibility on them and society as a whole, of course. But really to say that there isn't this divide between, this is public, that's private. But these things have to fall into one another so that we can see an actual change within it.
Yes. So I think now just crossing over to the GB Monitor very quickly, Tammy spoke about the secondary victimization within the justice system. Could you kind of give us an overview of reporting GBV cases, specifically to the reasons that contribute to victims not wanting to report their case, or the problems victims face at a SAPS level, because that's a critical conversation.
It is, it is an act of courage when you decide that you're going to report an injustice. And it is, you need even more courage to see this through. And there's various points where, you do experience secondary victimization. And that is even before, you want to take that act of courage to say, this is what has happened to me and I need justice to prevail. Arriving at a police station and having to speak to a stranger about something that is so heinous that has happened to you, it's already something that would discourage you to want to see it through. And just at a general point is that you would speak to a police officer, whoever is made available to you at that time, to say you would like to report domestic violence or rape or assault, whatever it is that you'd be dealing with at the time. And then you would then be given the relevant person from the unit, the family violence GBV unit there at the police station, and then that is where you would then tell your story. So I will use the example of what happens once you then speak to an official who then would put together your rape kit, your crime kit, to then take the process further. The amount of detail that you have to go into, for instance, if you have been raped, is a deterrent for you to really want to go and continue. You have to remember the exact time where you were at the time. You have to remember what this person was wearing or what you were wearing. And as someone who is traumatized or going through the trauma at the time, those aren't really details that you would want to capture in your memory when something like that happens to you. You need to remember, an official will ask you, what was the size of, your perpetrator's genitalia? Do you have an idea, centimeters? That is the kind of, there's no way, chances of you capturing that in that moment are so minimal, but that is the kind of detail that the investigating officer is going to need to take the process forward. And even after that, once then, it gets handed over from SAPS and now into, the court process, that is also very intimidating. It's an act, it's, secondary victimization taking effect.
Of secondary trauma.
Yes.
That going through
at
the process
every
itself.
stage of you seeking justice, you are going to fall back into this trauma, having to relive it, this secondary victimization that continues to follow you. And having to deal with a case manager who then takes you through the process of what it is that you would be expecting once you're going through, trial at that stage. So those are all examples of just the various stages that you have to conquer that secondary victimization, because that is the reality. I mean, we saw it with the Cheryl Zondi case. I mean, it was publicized almost every day in the news. And we see how the criminal justice system is really out to get you. right? It's not really there to serve you. It is the burden of the survivor to prove, and to be believed and to say, this is what has happened to me and I
Yeah.
need justice to prevail.
So that's why I think it would be doing the public a disservice to speak unilaterally, only from the point of view of, a survivor, because the more evolved way of thinking about this is that as much as we don't really want to admit it, the perpetrator, as much as the survivor, have been victims of the socialization process, because the perpetrator has seen this behavior and they've chosen to repeat it. So we have this male issue that is not recognized as such, at least on their part. On their part, it's not recognized as such. And we have women or marginalized groups having to take accountability for violence that is perpetrated against them. And I think I speak for every woman or marginalized group when I say this. We live very calculated lives. We live calculated lives, and I think each and every single one of us has sent that text. I'll let you know when I get home safe. And that just speaks about the reality that we're facing. And for the most part, I think we'd all agree that we've had these conversations. We've had them, guys. We've had these conversations.
I know
Women's Day.
I know we're wrapping up, but I'm just saying we must also have them in churches.
Yeah. Women's Day, Women's Month, 16 days of activism. And on that merry-go-round, when that one case spurs that we all just jump on in the social media space. But what are the solutions? Because how do we transition from am I next to what's next? How do we make that transition?
It's so simple because men just need to stop doing it.
It is.
It is not a complicated, convoluted, big thing that we just cannot figure out. Men have a certain level of power. The power dynamics are in their favor. They know they can do this thing, and they do it knowing that chances are they will be able to get away with it. So it's really that simple. Men need to stop doing it. We need to have a different conversation in our own social circles about what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. And we just need to believe women, LGBTQIA people as well. When someone comes forward to say, this is what has happened to me, we have a responsibility to respond and to say, I believe you. That is the
Yes.
first response we should always have, because we know how difficult it is to already verbalize this and say, this is what has happened to me. It's already a moment of trauma and secondary victimization. So I think those are the two things that really
Yeah.
stand out. Men should stop doing it, and communities and the system needs to believe and support victims when they come forward.
And it's crazy that you say that, because I think from the standpoint of a perpetrator, it's innocent until proven guilty. And from the standpoint of someone who survives this, it's guilty until proven otherwise. It's the inverse, and that's such an issue. And I think you brought in the existence of theocracy, and I love to entertain that conversation. And I think I would love you to, speak about religion as a construct and how you believe we could have those conversations within those churches.
No, I mean, if we start a conversation about that, that's going to take forever. But I think I just in closing for my end, I think that the conversation must go into various different spaces.
Yes.
And understand how those institutions have kind of like contributed to the injustices of this country. I think humans need to stop. Not just men. I think everyone needs to stop doing the wrong thing, because I know of cases where also there are men who've been abused. There are heterosexual men who've been sexually violated, and the groups of individuals, all of us need to stop. Need to stop. It's wrong, and when you hear me say no, it's not a no because I'm saying push. And psychology does that. When people are so afraid of hearing somebody say no to them, they try and push and push and push. So push it, people, be aware of them, and let's all stop. Conversations around churches, needs a whole different different platform.
Yes.
You know, it needs another 90 minutes, which we don't have. But yeah, you know,
Guys, do you have any
because
plans after this? We will
God
say.
loves us all. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, to just, wrap it up, it's more or less, accountability on a part of, the justice system, and also most importantly, having rehabilitation available for those who are part of the justice system. I don't know if there's anything that you can add just before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think I agree, with my panelists. Everybody needs to stop.
Everybody.
And I think these conversations have been had so many times that nobody can say they don't know what intimate partner violence is. Nobody can say that they don't understand what it is, and what's wrong and what's right. And so there needs to be, and if there's anybody who doesn't understand what's wrong and right, you have a responsibility amongst yourself to do the research, do the work, to find out what's right and find out what's wrong. So that so people don't have to suffer at your hands,
Okay.
And I think as well that we need to also ask ourselves, what is it about gender-based violence that makes us uncomfortable to such a point that we have to victimize people that speak out about it? Somebody mentioned that we need to lean into that uncomfortableness, that uncomfortable conversation. That's what we need to lean into, and we need to be. We need to make concerted efforts to make sure that whoever wants to speak out about it, whoever is speaking out about it, whoever is a survivor who's saying, this is my perpetrator, this is what
Perfect.
they did, we need to hold space for that person. We need to make
Yes.
sure there's enough spaces for people to be able to do the work that they have to do around this. And as soon as we find ourselves in a position where people no longer are able to do that, then we're in serious trouble.
Perfect. Thank you so much to the panel. You guys are absolutely incredible, and I hope, if anything, this is a moment that serves it's not only a knowledgeable moment. I think it's one that we need to bring about that action that is necessary. It's all about, developments on the ground, and that's what we're working towards. So thank you guys so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
That wasn't so.
Oh, I thought.